The Witch of Rathdowney, Anonymous. It was about 80 years ago, in the north of May, that a Roman Catholic clergyman near Rathdowney, in the Queen's Country, was awakened at midnight to attend the dying man in the distant part of the parish. The priest obeyed without a murmur, and having performed his duty to the expiring sinner, saw him depart this world before he left the cabin. As it was yet dark, the man who had called upon the priest offered to accompany him home, but he refused, and set forward on his journey alone. He had not gone far when the grey dawn began to appear on the hills, and he amused himself in contemplating the varied, lovely scenes prepared in the intelligent observer by the splendid breaking of a May-Day morning. The eastern sky was streaked with all the magnificent shades of crimson, blue, and gold, so peculiar to rosy May, and the brilliant morning star that shining and refulgently as if it had been created by that very hour. Everything was hushed in the calm repose, except the merry lark, as Shakespeare calls her, which posed high in the air amid the fleecy gold clouds, poured forth her maiden hymn of praise and gratitude to the great author of the universe, or the wild, discordant cry of the hither bleat from the adjacent morasses, or the irregular pattering of the large dewdrops as they fell like globules of liquid silver on the stirless trees at either side of the road. The good priest was highly enraptured with the beauty of the scene, and rode on, now gazing intently at every surrounding object, and again cutting with his whip at the bats and the big, beautiful night flies which flitted ever and anon from hedge to hedge across his lonely way. Thus engaged, he journeyed on slowly until the nearer approach of the sunrise began to render objects completely discernible. But he dismounted from his horse, and slipping his arm out of the rein, and drawing forth his breviary from his pocket, he commenced reading his morning office as he walked leisurely along. He had not proceeded very far when he observed the horse, a very spirited animal, endeavoring to stop on the road, and gazing intently into the field on one side of the way. There were the 3 or 4 cows gazing. However, he did not pay any particular attention to the circumstance, but went on a little further, when the horse suddenly lunged with great violence, and endeavored to break away by force. The priest with great difficulty succeeded in restraining him, and, looking at him more closely, observed him shaking from head to foot, and sweating profusely. He now stood calmly, and refused to move from where he was, nor could threats or entreaty induce him to proceed. The father was greatly astounded, but recollecting to have often heard about horses laboring under frights being induced to go by blindfolding them, he took out his handkerchief and tied it across his eyes. Then mounted, and striking him gently, he went forward without reluctance, but still sweating and trembling violently. They had not gone far when they arrived opposite a narrow path or bridleway, flanked at either side by a tall, thick hedge, which led to the high road of the field where the cows were grazing. The priest happened by chance to look into the lane, and he saw a spectacle which made the blood curdle in his veins. It was the legs of a man from the hips downwards, without a head or body, trotting up the avenue with a smarting pace. The good father was very much alarmed, but being a man of strong nerve, he resolved, come what might, to stand, and be further acquainted with this singular spectre. He accordingly stood, and so did the headless apparition, as if afraid to approach him. The priest, observing this, pulled back a little from the entrance of the avenue, and the phantom again resumed its progress. It soon arrived on the road, and the priest now had sufficient opportunity to view it minutely. It wore yellow buckskin breeches, tightly fastened at the knees, with a green ribbon. It had neither shoes nor stockings on, and its legs were covered with long red hairs, and, and all full of wet blood and clay, apparently contracted in its progress through the thorny hedges. The priest, although very much alarmed, felt eager to examine the phantom, and for this purpose he determined to screw his courage to the sticking point, and to summon all his philosophy to enable him to speak to it. The ghost was now a little ahead, pursuing its march at the usual brisk pace, and the priest urged on the horse speedily until it came up with it, and thus addressed it. "Halloa, friend, who art thou, and whither art thou going so early?" The hideous spectre made no reply, but uttered a fierce and superhuman growl, or "Umph." "A fine morning for ghosts to wander about," again said the priest. Another "Umph" was the reply. "Why don't you speak?" "Umph." "You don't seem disposed to be very loquacious this morning." "Umph" again. The good man began to feel irritated at the obstinate silence of this unearthly visitor, and said, with some warmth, "In the name of all that's sacred, I command you to answer me. Who art thou, and where art thou traveling?" Another "Umph," more loud and more angry than before, was the only reply. "Perhaps," said the father, "a taste of the whipcord might render you a little bit more communicative." And so saying, he struck the apparition with a heavy blow of his whip on the breech. The phantom uttered a wild and unearthly yell, and fell forward on the road. And what was the priest's astonishment when he perceived the whole place running over with milk. He was dumbstruck with amazement. The prostrate phantom still continued to eject vast quantities of milk from every part. The priest's head swam and his eyes got dizzy. A stupor came upon him for some minutes, and on his recovering the frightful spectre had vanished, and in its stead he found stretched on the road and half drowned in milk the form of Sarah Kennedy, an old woman from the neighborhood, who had been long notorious in the district for her witchcraft and superstitious practices. And it was now discovered that she had, by infernal aid, assumed that monster's shape and was employed that morning in sucking the cows of the village. Had a volcano burst at his feet, he could not have been more astonished. He gazed while with silent amazement, the old woman groaning and writhing convulsively. "Sarah," he said at length, "I have long admonished you to repent of your evil ways, but you were deaf to my entreaties, and now, wretched woman, you are surprised in the midst of your crime?" "Oh, father, father," shouted the unfortunate woman, "can you do nothing to save me? I am lost. Hell is open for me, and legions of devils surround me at this moment, waiting to carry my soul to perdition." The priest had not the power to reply. The old wretch's pains increased. Her body swelled in an immense size. Her eyes flashed as if in fire. Her face was black as night. Her entire form writhed in 1,000 different contortions. Her outcries were appalling. Her face sunk, her eyes closed, and in a few minutes she expired in the most exquisite tortures. The priests departed homewards, and called at the next cabin to give notice of the strange circumstances. The remains of Sarah Kennedy were removed to the cabin and situated on the edge of the small wood at a little distance. She had long been a resident of the neighborhood, but she still was a stranger, and came there no one knew from whence. She had no relation in that country but one daughter, now advanced in years, who resided with her. She kept one cow, and sold more butter, it was said, than any farmer in the parish, and it was generally suspected that she acquired it by devilish agency, as she made a secret of being intimately acquainted with sorcery and fairyism. She professed the Roman Catholic religion, but never complied with the practices enjoined by that church. and her remains were denied Christian scepter and were buried in a sandpit near her own cabin. On the evening of her burial, the villagers assembled and burned her cabin to the earth. Her daughter made her escape and never after returned.